Spinal work, and also incorporating the scapula, represents a body of practice which is ongoing with regards to developing patterns as well as physiological potentials through the movement of your spine and your scapula within certain frames. In the initial instances, we work a lot more with isolated types of rolling through different planes of motion, focusing on, for example, the torso, the pelvis, or more specifically things such as the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine as well, then incorporating aspects of shoulder rotations to facilitate movement of the scapula. When we think about spinal waves, spinal rolling, or spinal work in general, there are a few perspectives that we need to take into account. For example, as we are dealing with movement with regards to a movement practice, our initial point of departure are those movement patterns. So, for example, whilst there are many physiological and wellness benefits to be gained from practicing these different patterns, the ultimate goal is essentially to develop these patterns in isolated forms, then be able to integrate them, and then be able to express them in different ways as part of developing a movement vocabulary. With regards to the physiological benefits, if you have not practiced spinal work in any other forms in your previous disciplines, whether that is, for example, dance or whether as part of a martial art, it can be quite difficult to understand how to move your spine. This then brings us to developing physiological limitations. So, for example, if you're habitually in a particular posture, whether that is, for example, working at a desk, or whether it's an habitual posture which is quite rigid, such as if you're quite familiar with working with weights, with squatting and things like this, or deadlifts, these do end up giving you an habitual structure for your spine, which is then somewhat limiting with regards to its movement potential. Essentially, you develop a spine for a specific job, whereas ultimately what we want for general movement is an adaptable spine that can work in many different situations, through many different planes, with various loads, in various structures, and in various positions. So in the initial instance, what we are normally dealing with is quite simply motor amnesia. Motor amnesia. Also described as an absence of information, an absence of neural drive in the particular muscles that are responsible for moving certain parts of your spine, if you bring the information and if you bring the movement to those areas. But just as any other part of the muscles in our bodies, they can essentially begin to wane or die off of our cortical map when not used, essentially under a perspective of use it or lose it. It's exactly the same for certain aspects of the spine. With regards to other benefits that come in with spinal work, because a lot of the movements that we're working with, whether it's related to the pelvis, whether it's related to the shoulders, whether it's related to the thoracic spine, it also does encourage movement of fluids through your body, such as general blood flow, such as lymph flow, some things which can be stagnated within your body for many years, if not decades. And essentially, the movement of the spine is like a pumping action. The spine in itself can be described as a pump. And if you think that we are perhaps in certain habitual situations sitting on this pump all day, or if we're blocking this pump in certain ways, and those natural flows of blood, of lymph and things like this, they end up getting blocked, and essentially movement in itself, in its wider perspective, is blocked as well. In beginning with certain isolated rolling or waving of the spine, This is given in preparation essentially to then be able to integrate them with larger waves, and we're going to be focusing specifically today on these more macro waves, or these more gross spinal waves. One of the main things that we want to focus on first of all is the perspective of rhythmicality in your spinal wave. Rhythmicality. So what does this mean? Rhythmicality essentially means that when you're performing a spinal wave, we are looking as a neutral point to be able to develop a wave in which no one part of the spine is moving faster or slower or bigger or smaller than another part of the movement. This can also be described as magnitude, how big or how small your wave is, which is also affected by the speed that you are going as well. And whilst in the future it's perfectly fine to mix the magnitude and change the rhythmicality, in the initial instance it's very important to develop a 0 point from which then to develop and explore from. So we'll take first of all the example of the sagittal wave, which is working in this plane of motion, and looking at the up-down wave, starting from the head and going down, and the down-up wave, which essentially starts from even the knees and going upward. With the sagittal wave, when I'm working down-up, one of the things that I'm always thinking of is that my weight is centered, and we've seen this in many different places. We've seen this with force generation and transmission. It's the same stance in which I'm sunk into the bar stool. My hips are slightly under, the knees are soft, and most importantly, in this position, the hips can move. In a spinal wave, we are essentially transmitting a wave through the body, and you must think that if any part is blocked, whether that's because of your structure or whether because it's physiological restriction, it will prevent that wave from expressing itself fully. This is the work. It will not happen from the beginning. This is the practice. As I start with a down-up spinal wave, I make sure I'm centered and I embody this sensation so I know that when I'm practicing, I can notice if I find myself waving back and forth. So for example, I should never feel the weight shifting in the feet from the heels to the toes. The weight should always be centered. Likewise, at no point should the toes lift, at no point should the heels lift, at no point should I bend forward, at no point should I bend back. I'm staying completely centered. With my knees soft, for the down-up wave, I slightly initiate from the knees as the knees slide forward, and the consequence is that it pulls my pelvis under. By sliding those knees forward, it pulls the pelvis under. And I'm really trying to feel that it's the knees, it pulls the tail to the sacrum, and then the lumbar spine going up through each vertebrae. It slips forward, it pulls the lumbar spine under. This then affects further up the spine. It goes all the way up to the head, and now already I've entered now extension, but even before it travels fully to the head, I'm already pulling back in. It comes up, and here it's gone naturally into lumbar extension, and I'm already pulling back in. Why am I already pulling back in? Because it's a consistent cyclical movement. It takes me naturally to extension, almost extending with the head, and then it flows up. And now this is a perfect place to start with your spinal wave. Controlled, rhythmical. I'm actively searching in each of my vertebrae to find any sticky points. What is a sticky point? A sticky point is essentially when something like this happens. So as you can see, the sticky point, which is a very common sticky point now, is my lumbar spine. Actually, I'm not even moving my lumbar spine, I'm just hinging, but I have perhaps this deadlift back pattern, and so all I'm doing is waving my head and moving my knees. Whereas the work is here, it's here, it's here, it's here, it's here. It goes up, and then I repeat. Some common mistakes that can happen. Normally, people just start too big too soon. The problem with starting with a big spinal wave like this is that you cannot locate or determine where any specific issues are because the pattern is too big. There's too much distraction happening. Start smaller. Rather than working with a big spinal wave like this, for example, smaller. Here. This is also a spinal wave. This is a flicker of a wave. And this is rhythmical. And then when I have this pattern, of course, I can choose to increase the magnitude, increase the magnitude, increase the magnitude, but as long as the rhythmicality stays the same throughout. And I also encourage you, as you're working through your 3, 5, 7, 10 minutes of spinal waves, do explore these magnitudes that are available to you, if they are available to you. So for example, it would make sense to start the first few minutes just with a light wave. Just a flicker of a flame. A flicker of a flame. And then over time, it grows. It grows. It grows. This is still a spinal wave. This is still a spinal wave, if it is still rhythmical. And notice that even here, my weight is centered. I'm not leaning forward, I'm not leaning backward. Everything is kept down through the middle. Continuing working, and one point, ensure that when you wave, even if you come up, the knees should not block at any point. They should not lock out. They will come towards a straighter position, but as soon as you go, you've just blocked the wave. As I'm working, even here, I go straight back in. Straight back in. The knees stay soft. The shoulders are not moving in this pattern. There will be some movement from the shoulders as a consequence of the movement of the thoracic spine, for example, but they are not moving of their own accord. So another common mistake in this isolated way is movement of the shoulders. This is fine, this is something different, however. We are isolating the wave so that in the future we can integrate other aspects where needed, but it should be added consciously, not unconsciously that I don't realize I'm moving my shoulders. This is a practice of many years, which is an exciting thing because it means there's a lot to learn. Moving on to the up-down wave. The up-down wave is initiated by the head. The down-up wave was initiated by the knees. More specifically, with the up-down wave, it's initiated with the top of the head, as if I'm dipping in underneath something. I take my stance, soft in the knees, sat in the bar stool, the hips can move. I start with the cervical spine, initiated by the head, going under, ensuring that I'm not entering into an habitual pattern here in the lumbar spine, and keeping it nice and soft, just from starting with the head, digging under the bridge. It travels down, it's coming down my spine, and as I come towards extension in the hips, I'm already going back in with the head, It's pulling under the bridge, and it's already coming back around. And again, cyclical, constant, rhythmical. Some issues that can happen is, for example, a big movement with the head and then just a little movement with the body. Big movement with the head, a little movement with the body. Or something like this. This is not rhythmical because your head is moving a ridiculous amount and everything else is not moving. So do monitor these things. The easiest thing to do is to work in a mirror. A mirror or a reflective surface. The reason this is the perfect modality to check yourself in this context is because spinal waves as patterns are ultimately aesthetic. The goal is not aestheticism. We don't work this to make it look beautiful, but because a wave is a shape, we're looking for an actual wave. It's not just called a spinal wave, we are looking for a wave. The easiest way to monitor an aesthetic quality is the reflective surface, the mirror, which is why it's the modality of choice for the dancer, for example. In coming to my spinal wave, once again with the up-down, I can start small, rhythmical, and as I develop, I can go bigger, 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 throughout my set, as long as the rhythmicality stays there. Again, avoiding any movement in the shoulders, anything happening here, just working with the head as the initiation point, and the wave flowing down the spine, keeping my weight centered, ensuring that I'm not moving back or shifting forward or counterbalancing, staying completely in the center and working through my spine from the top down. Again, it may be very common that you will experience the movement of the head and the lumbar spine is kind of just blocked. This, again, is the practice that will develop over time. Coming back to this idea of blockages when you're exploring the sagittal wave, up, down, and down, up, there are some physiological feedback that you can refer to know that you are developing physiological restrictions. For example, cracking, popping in the spine. This is something that can be very, very common when you're working spinal waves, and you should get to know where you feel these physiological restrictions specifically in your spine. So for example, you may find that when you're working the down-up wave, that in the lumbar spine, you can feel this. Explore this every time, and monitor over time how it develops, how it changes, how it feels. Likewise, for some people who are very stuck in the thoracic spine, you may find that when you're working your up-down wave, perhaps when you really dig in here, you might feel it as you come forward, as you extend, or as you flex the thoracic spine. Again, these are all valuable things, it's all valuable feedback that should inform your specific practice, because after all, there is no one single spinal wave. There's probably about almost 8 billion spinal waves now and counting in the world. Everyone's spine will be different. We're just working within a specific frame which allows you to investigate how your spine is feeling, how your spine is moving, and developing patterns through that process. Moving on to the frontal spinal wave, again it follows the same pattern of down, up, and up, down. The frontal spinal wave essentially means that we're now working in the frontal plane. It's also referred to as the lateral spinal wave because the movement is in a lateral motion, but the plane we're working in is in the frontal plane. Once again, it's very, very important that I work with all the same baseline perspectives from the sagittal spinal wave, which is the idea of rhythmicality, no one part of the spine moving bigger or smaller or faster or slower than another, same magnitude, and also keeping your center of mass centered. So we are not shifting weight from left to right foot, even though we're working with a spinal wave. I'm working here with my lateral wave in the frontal plane, but what's happening now is I'm shifting my weight from foot to foot. This is not what we're looking for. Keep your weight centered. Likewise again, soft in the knees, soft in the hips. Soft in the hips here becomes incredibly important for the frontal spinal wave, working in with this lateral motion, because this is now integral to the initiation of the wave for transmitting it up and transmitting it down the body. Just as with the sagittal wave, it was incredibly important for us to work with this hip tilting motion as I'm working, for example, down, up, or if I'm working up, down. It's the same idea, but now this tilting is happening in the frontal plane, which means a lot of movement, the movement that was previously here in the sagittal plane, is now happening here in the frontal plane. We already have some resources for this idea of hip hiking and hip dropping. We already have other patterns that deal with this. However, briefly, the knees are working like pistons to lift the hip or drop the hip. To lift the hip or to drop the hip. It is not a shifting of the hip to the side, which is something completely different. It's a hip hike, hip drop, hip hike, hip drop. This is one of the fundamental ideas of the frontal spinal wave. However, we are now using this, beginning with the down-up lateral wave, we are now using this impulse of the hip to affect the wave, to initiate the wave. And what happens is I apply pressure through the ball of my foot, and watch what happens when I apply pressure through the ball of the foot. The heel naturally lifts here, it hikes my hip, the impulse goes through the hip, it transverses across through into the lumbar spine, and it pulls the rest of my spine across. Watch closely. other side. I give the impulse, it goes into the hip, through the lumbar spine, and then up the body. If I have a lot of blockage in the lumbar spine, this is where the work is. Really here. Here in the lumbar spine. This is the first place you should feel it. If you find yourself pushing and you're just pushing up through, this is not the same. I'm actually missing out my lumbar spine, and now the force, instead of going here into the spine, instead of hiking and it coming this way to affect the spine, I'm actually now just shifting up to the shoulder. This is not the same idea. I'm completely missing the lumbar spine, and now I'm just performing a frontal wave, just working with the shoulders, and I'm missing out this part, which is integral. The pattern that we're looking for, hiking into the lumbar spine, switching, and again, this is a perfect magnitude to start with. This is a perfect speed to start with. At this speed, you can diagnose and work through any sticky points. Also, when you're working this way, make sure that you don't start working into extreme lumbar extension like this. Still keep yourself seated as you work here in the frontal plane. Likewise, as I'm sending the wave up, it finishes out through the head. I work in the mirror or a reflective surface, a window at night time, or I pull the shutters down if I have shutters. And this is the wave I work with. Again, of course, you can increase the magnitude, but the rhythmicality stays the same. Some mistakes that can often be seen with this one are very, very similar to the other way. For example, here, this is great, I'm moving my cervical spine a lot, not really anything else. Other things that can happen is that this impulse is not connected with the wave and it becomes disjointed. Sometimes the idea is there, but it kind of breaks. Something like this. Very many artistic interpretations. Essentially, in this instance, slow it down and feel each vertebrae. Try to feel it as much as you can. And even now, I can hear my spine, when I slow it down, in those sticky points in my thoracic spine. And this is precisely, as a diagnosis and a treatment tool, what we want to apply a tool such as the frontal spinal wave for. Now I'm moving from the down up now into the up down. It's precisely the opposite, which means I lead with the head. The head travels further down the spine, from the cervical down to the thoracic spine. And now the heel lifts as a consequence of movement happening further up the chain. So, basically, when I move this way, I'm pulling. I'm already going back this way with the head, but now this is pulling the hip up, and because the hip is now lifted, the heel of the foot lifts. And you now see that it makes this type of S shape. I'm actually here going this way, this is still travelling back that way because it's a wave. And again, working controlled, rhythmical. If I want, I can make it bigger. And even though it's a very large wave, I am not shifting my weight. My weight is centered. Once again, I encourage you to explore different magnitudes throughout the 3, 5, 7, 10 minutes that you're working. Explore smaller waves, always starting smaller, and when you feel it's time, work with a larger magnitude. See how it works, see if you can maintain the patterning. When we start mixing spinal waves, essentially the challenge here is now to find or map the various points at which it's optimal to switch your spinal wave. So for example, working with the down-up spinal wave, I'm practicing here, my down-up, and I think to myself, okay, I'm going to switch to the up-down, but I need to think and give myself a moment, when am I going to do that? I'll give myself a count of 3. I'll go 3, 2, 1. I go back the way I came. Immediately. Then I try it again. Okay, I go 3, 2, 1. And then go back the way I came. And you will find that you'll be changing at a certain point. So for example, it's very easy to change from here and then go straight to the up-down way. And it's very easy to change from here and then go into the down-up wave. But try to find parts where it's not so intuitive to change and map them. So for example, if I go here, okay, now I have to change the wave. Now it gets a bit tricky and I might even trip myself up. This is part of the practice as well. So down-up wave, down-up wave, down. Okay, now I go in. Not a great change. So we work again. Down-up wave, down-up wave, down. Better. And the same as we work with the lateral spinal wave with switching. I'm working down, up, down, up, down, up. I switch, switch, switch. Digging into the lumbar spine, loosening the hips, and then I switch again. And again, there are certain points where it's nicer to switch than others. For example, here, I can now just push and then I change my wave. But if I search for places that are more difficult, well, a little bit more tricky. But, as you're working with this, do in the initial instance make sure, of course, you've developed the fundamental up-down or the fundamental down-up before you're mixing, before you're trying to trip yourself up. Make sure you have something to trip over in the first place, which is why we start normally with these waves quite isolated, quite repetitive, before we start with switching directions and, of course, integrating these patterns. So, when you're working with your spinal waves, the baseline takeaways are: keep your weight centered at all times when we're working with static spinal waves, which means not moving through space. Keeping your weight centered at all times. You should feel this in your feet. Number 2 main takeaway, rhythmicality. No one part of your spine should move faster or slower or bigger or smaller than another part. Number 3, tying closely to rhythmicality, is magnitude. And magnitude is something you can play with. Magnitude basically means how big or small it is, or how fast or slow it is. As long as you're keeping the rhythmicality, everything the same, you can of course explore a bigger magnitude, a wave of bigger magnitude or a smaller magnitude, even just a flicker. Explore this spectrum, but as mentioned already, working with a smaller magnitude, working more finely in the initial instance is what is going to give you the neural feedback and help you diagnose these sticky points that are particular to you in the early stages. So rather than jumping into a large magnitude wave in the beginning, even if it is rhythmical, I encourage you to start smaller and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and then coming back again and then exploring this spectrum.